Father Dr. Michael James Oleska. He was born in Allentown, Pennsylvania, and educated at Georgetown University, St. Vladimir's Orthodox Theological Seminary, and he earned his doctorate in Czechoslovakia. He was ordained in Napakiak, Alaska, and has served a dozen Orthodox Christian communities across Alaska, has taught on all three main campuses of the University of Alaska system. He has authored 5 books, all related to Alaska Native cultures and history, and is currently the acting dean of St. Michael's Cathedral in Sitka. Please give a warm welcome to Dr. Father Michael James Oleska.
Thank you, Gunash. I came to Sitka for the first time in 1970, after the canonization of St. Herman in Kodiak, and then His Grace Bishop Theodosius. It's really his doing that we have so many seats. If you go back in history, because these seats weren't for us, they were for the Russian-American dance group. And this place will be filled when the boat arrives tomorrow. It should have been here today, and there'll be all these people watching the dancers. But that was thanks to Bishop Theodosius back in the late 1960s. And he invited me not only to come here for the summer of 1971, but to stay for the succeeding school year. So back when I was a student still, I spent a year and a half here in Sitka, visited Angoon, Hoonah, and Wrangell. And it's the Edgecombe students who are graduating this Friday who invited me to visit their villages in western Alaska, where I met my wife, and the rest is history. Except for one other thing that involves Sitka. On our honeymoon, for our honeymoon, I asked my wife where she wanted to go, Honolulu or Sitka. She chose Sitka. I think we were famous in Sitka for about 20 years for that decision. In any case, I've been here for a while. And I was, as my earliest childhood recollection, when adults asked me at the age of 3 and 4, Michael, what do you want to be when you grow up? I would say an Indian. I wanted to be an Arapaho, a Comanche, an Iroquois. Name the tribe, it didn't matter. I was in war paint and feathers till I was at least 10. It was the age of, you know, the Westerns on TV, and I really felt the Indians were getting the shaft. I don't know where I got that idea at such a young age, but I was on the Cowboys and Indians, I was the Indian, never the cowboy. In any case, when I was in graduate school, at Georgetown, in fact, before I went to graduate school, I visited my seminary, St. Vladimir's, and there was a senior about to graduate with a map bigger than this on his dormitory wall. And the southern half was covered in pins. And I had to go in, Bob, what's the map of Alaska on all these pins? Are you doing voodoo or planning an invasion? I couldn't. He said, no, these are our parishes. Indian, Eskimo, and Aleut parishes in Alaska. It never crossed my mind. Here are my lifelong interests, overlapping, congruent, on American soil. I don't even need a passport to get here. This I've got to see. So I did my best to find a job up here. That was back in 69. No luck. And then, out of the clear blue, the village of Old Harbor on Kodiak Island sent a letter to the seminary asking for, well, they wanted a priest, but they couldn't find one. So they said, we'll settle for a seminarian. And of course, I volunteered first and last, I think, and I was here within 2 weeks. I fell in love with Kodiak Island upon sight. It was so beautiful. And they put me into a flying machine called a Grumman Goose. I'm sorry they don't still have those planes. They're rather remarkable contraptions. They could take off or land on either water or soil. They didn't tell me this. They put me in this machine. It waddled off the runway in Kodiak. It belly flopped onto the North Pacific Ocean, and it tried mightily to take off. One propeller started, and there was a lot of water against one window and then the other. Felt more like a submarine than an airplane. When it finally got airborne, it flew over some of the most spectacularly beautiful landscape in the world. Then it belly flopped on the ocean, waddled ashore, and I fell out the side door. Welcome to Alaska. And I didn't realize it then, but I soon found out. I had landed at the place where the written history of our state began. Because in 1784 at Three Saints Bay, that's where Gregory Shelikoff landed with the first They weren't really colonists. It was a military invasion. We have to go back to the beginning of our history in a minute, but I'm just explaining why I ever got involved in this. I happened to land at the place where the written history of Alaska began, and after becoming their priest in the mid-70s, I got a village history grant from the Department of the Interior to write a village history. Most people were doing grandmother stories, interviewing the elders and going back 50 or 60 years. I went back into the Russian era because I found that I could explore history that had already been forgotten 2 centuries before my arrival. And that's what got me started. The resources I used, the Russian resources that had to be translated, became my first book, Alaskan Missionary Spirituality. Telling this same story in my own words became my dissertation, rewritten as Orthodox Alaska, and so forth. So it all started with Old Harbor and their invitation to come to the place where, now I want to start our story. Because what I've discovered, having worked with historians for decades now, is that every historian has a point of view, but they're very reluctant to admit it. They want to believe they're writing the truth. Now, I won't dispute with most of my historical friends about the truth. The truth are the facts of the case, what we can substantiate in written records, diaries, reports, eyewitness accounts, and so forth. But their warehouse is full of that. A historian doesn't have trouble finding material. It's not finding enough material to write a book. Most of the struggle of writing history is to decide what to leave out, because there's too much. And in order to sort out what's important and what isn't, you have to have a point of view. I think historians should just be honest about that. This history is written from the point of view of, and if it's just your own personal perspective, even that counts. I would say that because of my close association with and love for Alaska Native cultures, my point of view has clearly been Aleut. I look at the history. You see, I actually got my first history class in Kodiak teaching what was called Aleut history. There was another professor, not Haycox, somebody else from further away, who had written a book about Alaska, who was teaching Alaska history the same semester I was teaching Aleut history. And there were some students who were taking both classes. Halfway through the semester, they went to my colleague and said, we're taking Father Oleksa's Aleut history, and so far, nothing of what he's teaching us is in your history. And the professor from a faraway university said, well, that's easy to explain. Nothing from Father Oleksa's course was important. So they came down the hall to me, and they said, do you know what he said about your class? And I said, well, you're right if you are from where he's from. Because he's looking out his university business building, and he's surveying the landscape and asking himself, what do my students need to know to make sense of the life we have here? And I'm looking out my window in Old Harbor, Alaska, surveying that landscape, and asking myself the same question: what names and dates and places and events do my students need to know to make sense of here? Where I'm sitting determines what I'm going to write. You see what I'm saying? My point of view. So I preface everything I'm going to say because I have obviously, well, one point of view is that I'm an Orthodox Christian, but the most important one is I'm an Orthodox Christian who loved Native people before even met any, came here and have spent 50 years looking at the history of Alaska pretty much from the Alaska Native point of view, as best as I can do that, based on archival sources and oral traditions. So, to understand what has happened in Alaska, we actually have to go back very far, because histories are stories and ideas are histories. Ideas have histories, and those ideas are passed on from generation to generation, culture to culture, continent to continent. They tend to last very long, and some of the most important themes in our history to the present day, but certainly in Alaska history, the first 200 years or so go back to the time of, I don't know, those of you who are way in the back, I'm sorry, this is really too small, but this is supposed to be Europe over here. That's Spain, that's Italy, that's Greece, this is Turkey. And then I drew a map of basically the Mediterranean plus the Middle East. Why? Because that's where our story really begins. That's a long way back. Don't worry, I'm not going to linger here too long, but I want to introduce this theme. You see, Alexander the Great, in about three centuries BC, came from a tiny boondock of a town or country called Macedonia. I just covered the whole thing with a red dot. It's not very large. Macedonia, who ever heard of Macedonia? We forgot about it already. But it conquered the world. His empire covered what was then the empire, what would have been the empire of the Hittites and the Armenians, but also of the Babylonians and the Egyptians and the ancient Indians and the Persians. His empire included several other major and much more ancient and sophisticated empires. It's an important point. In other words, Alexander the Great, coming out of Macedonia, conquers Greece and keeps on going all the way to Pakistan. And in one lifetime, 12 years, he creates an empire that's actually multinational and multicultural. What does he gain by doing that? What does any conqueror gain by overrunning somebody else's empire?
He dies young.
But you get the riches of the country. You'd get the tax revenues. What does it take to be a citizen of Alexander the Great's empire? Pay your taxes and don't rebel. Swear allegiance to the sovereign and you're in. That's all it takes. Now, I mentioned this only in passing but it will be an important theme of our story. The Western Roman Empire, Julius Caesar marches into Gaul and then into Iberia. And he's conquering, well, I even left Britain off the map. I should have put it there because the Romans do get there actually. But they're overrunning people who are totally unlike Alexander's empire. These are hunting, gathering, what the civilized world called primitive peoples, illiterate peoples. Actually, the Greeks called them simply barbarians. And so his empire, you see, has a very different agenda. To be a citizen of the Roman Empire, we have to civilize you first. You're going to have to learn Latin. And once you shave your beard and put on a toga, you have a chance of getting in. But it takes more than just swearing allegiance to the emperor and paying your taxes to be a citizen of the Roman Empire. The Roman Empire justifies itself and the French Empire that followed them as la mission civilisatrice, the mission of civilization itself. And we justify our imperial policies by the fact that we're civilizing these barbarians. And to be a citizen, therefore, in the Western Roman Empire required everyone there to learn a common language, develop a common culture, you see, and become Roman, which is not the agenda in the East. Now, it's exactly along those lines that Europe, in fact, divides even to this day, somewhere along that line. To the east of this line, the Ottoman Empire, the Arab Empire before them, and the Soviet Empire, repugnant as it was, all share a common view of culture and language. We don't care what your language is. We don't care what your religion is. We don't care what your culture is. Pay your taxes and don't rebel. Swear allegiance to the sovereign, and you're in. In the West, if you want to be a citizen of our empire, you do it our way. The French insisted on everyone doing it the way they did it in Paris. The Spanish, the way everything is done in Madrid. The British, the way things are done in London. The Americans, the way things are done in our country. If you want to be a citizen, you become like us. These are very old attitudes that I'm starting my talk because they come 1,000 years later to the streets of Sitka. How? Well, 8 centuries later, Prince Rastislav, where I got my doctoral degree in Czechoslovakia, a little bit further north from Macedonia. He's ruling the province that was called in those days Moravia. It's where the Bohemia and Moravia are the 2 provinces of the Czech Republic to this day. Rastislav is newly arrived barbarian, and he knows it. We don't read and write, we don't have libraries, we don't have astronomy, we don't have medicine, we don't have any of the things that the people upriver in Bavaria, even though it's the dark ages of Europe, they're building stone bridges, they build castles, they have metal tools. We don't have any of that. So he sends a delegation to Bavaria and says to the German-speaking people there, can you teach us what you know? Oh, great, some barbarians to civilize. And the Germans are quite enthusiastic about this. But they say, you know, in order to do that, you're going to have to learn Latin and learn to do things in our cultural ways. And Rostislav kind of balked at that. Why should we have to learn an ancient and now dead language in order to get into the data bank that you have? Because that's the only civilized way to do it, say the Bavarians. Hold off, we'll get back to you. And Rostislav sends a delegation to Constantinople, where the universities are still functioning in the 9th century, and there's a department of linguistics that has already studied Slavic languages, and in fact have developed an alphabet for these Slavic barbarians to the north. Must I learn Greek in order to become civilized? No, 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 we can translate everything into your language. I'll go for that. And so two brothers, in fact, lead the delegation. Cyril and Methodius go north to what is now the Czech Republic, and they present an educational system in the Slavic language. But the Germans next door get wind of this, and they're very upset. You cannot civilize a barbarian people in a barbarian language. That's absurd. And so they both, since they're on the western part of the empire, they appeal to the Pope to decide who's right. The Pope says, let's get to the bottom of this. We'll have a public debate. This is the 860s, by the way. A public debate. All of you come over the Alps. We're going to meet in Venice. And you can both debate your side of the issue. So the Germans present theirs. Of course, it's the 9th century, the 800s. You need biblical text to support your argument. So the Germans say, well, when Pontius Pilate wrote the accusation against Christ and nailed it to his cross above his head, he did it in Latin, Hebrew, and Greek. So there you go. This was a convincing argument in the 9th century, apparently. The Greeks said, that may be true, but you know, in our part of the world, Christians don't just worship in Latin, Hebrew, and Greek. They worship in all these languages that are still functioning. Parthians and Medes mean people from Persia and people from North Africa. And we have, in Constantinople alone, we have churches worshiping in 6, 7, 8, 10 different languages. And by the way, on Pentecost, there's a list of how many languages the apostles began speaking, and Latin isn't one of them. The Greeks won the argument. And not only won it, but the Pope ordained Methodius, one of the two brothers, to go back to the Czech Republic as their first bishop. But the Germans still didn't take even the Pope's decision as final. They settled it. Maybe it's the first time in recorded European history, but they settled the argument in the way that they would do many more times in the future. They invaded Czechoslovakia. And they deposed Rostislav and blinded him. And they sent all the Greek missionary teachers eastward. They fled for their lives. And they settled in Macedonia. I had one Macedonian student who really loved this lecture. They settled in Macedonia for 100 years. And then in the 900s, the Prince of Kiev, the modern capital of Ukraine, Vladimir, was in the same position, the same dilemma as Rostislav had been 120 years earlier. He's illiterate. None of his people know reading and writing. They don't have any books. They don't have any astronomy. They don't have any medicine. They don't have any architecture. But they're aware that there are other more advanced civilizations nearby. So Vladimir sends out delegates to the Jewish community in the Crimea, the Tatar Muslims to the east, the West, they send them to Germany, and finally to the Greeks in the South. And the 4 delegations come back. Now, here's something just to pause and think about. Vladimir of Kiev could have chosen Islam as the national religion of Russia. How different would European and world history be if he had made that choice? I have, as a footnote here, my own opinion on why he rejected Islam. My relatives are Ukrainian. I don't think they would accept to this day a religion that forbade imbibing alcohol. They were already in the 10th century brewing the best vodka in the world. They would have had to give it up to become Muslim. Therefore, vodka saved Europe. In any case, we know that what choice they made. They affiliated themselves with the Byzantine Empire, and the Byzantine Emperor says, we have all the books you need. They're already translated. And he can send word to those monasteries around Lake Ohrid in Macedonia, because the translations were already made for Rostislav a century before. They could bring all those books, math, science, religion, anything you wanted to learn, all the classical knowledge that they had preserved, and in the Slavic language. So within a century, the Russians were developing their own architecture and had their own vibrant culture, which was then completely overrun and destroyed by the Tatar invasions of the 1200s. But for 3 centuries, they were on a roll. And it was because they were given an education in their own language, using their own alphabet with their own books. When the Tatars overrun and destroy this civilization, it takes the Slavic peoples, we would call them Ukrainian and Russian today, a couple hundred years to get back on their feet and eventually liberate their country from Tatar rule. This happens in the 1480 is Ivan the Great's defeat of the Tatars, and the people of Moscow and what is now European Russia no longer paying taxes to the Khan. No longer paying taxes means you're not part of their empire anymore. You've got your own. And within 70 years, Ivan the Terrible, as he's called, Ivan Grozny, he defeats the Tatars at Kazan. Kazan becomes the event where Russia is finally free of Mongol rule, absolutely. And sort of by accident, Russia becomes the inheritor of the Mongol Empire. So it's almost an accidental empire. But by defeating the Mongols, pushing them out of Europe, and then defeating them in Asia, they de facto become the imperial power now, filling that vacuum. And they have all of Siberia at their doorstep. It takes 200 years, and that's almost record time, 200 years for Slavic peoples of Eastern Europe to kind of spill over the Ural Mountains and then also sail along the Arctic Ocean. Because it's the exact date, 1550 something. By 1648, that's not even 2 centuries, they're at the Bering Sea. 1648 is Brezhnev's voyage around Chukotka. 150 years is almost record time, considering they were walking most of the way. And along the Arctic Ocean, they were sailing from the White Sea to the Pacific Ocean. It's over 5,000 miles. Why were they going along the Pacific Ocean? The Arctic Ocean, because that was the fastest way to move. Going water by water from river mouth to river mouth to river mouth allowed these frontiersmen to move much more fast, and actually to penetrate Siberia going upriver from the Yenisei and the Ob and the Lena and all the other rivers of Siberia. Going across Siberia where it's warmer at the south means going along the mountains and fording hundreds, maybe thousands of rivers and streams. So Siberia was actually explored, mapped, and the first traders made rapid progress going along the Arctic Ocean until, almost by accident again, they wound up in the Pacific Ocean. They didn't know it was there. 1728, Peter the Great hires Vitus of Bering to explore this region, we know. It's Bering's first voyage, and he's told to take all the wood you need out to the Pacific coast, because there isn't any there. There's no forest on the shore. Take all the wood you need, build yourself a boat, sail along the land until you get to America. That's pretty much a synopsis of Peter the Great's deathbed orders to Bering in 1728. So Bering does it. He builds a ship, he sails along the ocean, and he winds up in the Arctic. Because although every geographer in Europe expected the 2 continents to be joined, as we know, they're not. And when he came back, we're told this is the first real piece of Russian propaganda in Alaska history. It's not the last, but it's the first. We're told that the geographers in Europe, especially in Russia, rejected Bering's findings and said, go back and do it again. And we still report this for some reason in our history books. It's obviously not true. At the same time that we say in print, Bering was sent back to do it right, to do it again. We also have the map of his 2 voyages. The first one shows him leaving the Siberian coast, sailing along the Siberian coast, entering the Arctic Ocean, turning around and going back. Not even seeing Alaska because of the fog at St. Lawrence Island. But the second voyage, while we're saying he was sent to do it right the second time, the second voyage doesn't even enter the Bering Sea. Bering and Chirikov, Bering aboard the Sveti Petr, the St. Peter, and Chirikov aboard the St. Paul, companion ships, the Peter and the Paul, sailed to the tip of Kamchatka, found the city of Petropavlovsk, Petropavl, Peter and Paul, in 1742, and then they sailed directly east. Most of you probably know where they found Alaska, where they discovered Alaska. Most of my students think it must have been out in the Aleutian chain. No, Kayak Island, Yakutat. They were either very far off course or they were up to something else. And Chirikov, who was the second boat, the second in command, he actually got here first. He landed down near Ketchikan and made it back to Petropavlovsk in one piece. Bering landed near Yakutat, wrecked his boat, and died. But you've never heard of Chirikov. He's the one who got here first and got back in one piece. Bering got here second and never got home. And in every history book that I've ever read, they always say, Vitus Bering, a Dane in the service of the Russian Tsar, as if there were no Russians smart enough to do this, they had to hire a foreigner. But in fact, it's not true. The Russian got here first, made it back in one piece. Bering died, he gets all the credit. They named the whole ocean after him. Right? It pays to be the commander. In any case, the most important part for us is the wrecked ship. Because Bering's rather experienced seamen, they'd been traveling along the Arctic Ocean for 200 years. Bering's very experienced seamen built a new ship out of the wreckage of the old and came back into Petropavlovsk 1 year late. So Russian to be a year late. But in any case, they survived. And they survived with walrus tusks and sea otter pelts. And as you all know, this set off a fur rush eastward to Alaska. Furs were the oil of that time. We think of furs as an unnecessary luxury, but before synthetic materials were developed, everybody in a cold country needed a coat. And the coat had to be made out of something warm, mainly fur. It was not a luxury at all, but a necessity. Now, the first 50 years, therefore, of Alaska's history are probably the murkiest, from 1741 to 91. Those 50 years are the years we know the least about. People think they know a lot about that era, thanks to the writings of an American historian, Hubert George Bancroft, who wrote the first history of Alaska within a decade of the purchase. He wrote it back in the 1870s. But Mr. Bancroft never came to Alaska. Mr. Bancroft didn't know Russian. Any material, any archival sources presented to him were beyond his comprehension. He had to hire people to collect the data and translate it for him. And we know who he hired. He hired a man named Ivan Petrov, who under oath years later admitted that he made most of what he fed Mr. Bancroft. He made it up. And especially for the first 50 years, you see, Bancroft was an American. We were winning the West down south, right? Cowboys and Indians, as I mentioned earlier. And he projected all of that to the north. There's several reasons why, however, we have to reconsider almost everything we learned about these first 50 years. First of all, who went over the Ural Mountains into Siberia after the conquest of Kazan? Who went there first? Exactly the same as American history. Who went into the newly purchased Louisiana territory after it became American? The fur traders, the mountain men, the frontiersmen, the Davy Crockett, Daniel Boone, Jeremiah Johnson, revenant kind of people, right? The bachelors who, with no intention of marrying, they just want to set up their trap lines, build a log cabin, hunt, fish, and be married. Those are the people who went into Siberia in the 14 and 1500s. If they ever married, and most of them didn't, but if they ever did, it was a local indigenous woman, somebody from a local trading partner, a tribe. And so across Siberia, there were kids, starting in the 1500s already, who were part Slavic and part native, Siberian native. And if they moved further west, already of mixed parentage, they married another Siberian woman. By the time they came to the Pacific coast, we would say it was Siberian native people who were coming to Alaska. Their Slavic ancestry had been left far behind. Dr. Lydia Black discovered, I wish I knew where this archive was. Unfortunately, she died and didn't leave me the information, even in her will. It's somebody's PhD dissertation, but she discovered in Irkutsk an amazing file on the Promyshleniki, these frontiersmen. They had to apply for business licenses. How czarist of them. The government required anyone operating in the Alaska fur trade to apply for a license, and the license applications are several pages long. And they include not just your name and address, but who are your parents, what's your ethnic background, where do you come from? In other words, we could find out who these frontiersmen really were, ethnically, from this one file. There are hundreds, maybe thousands of them. And she estimated in her day of research there that 1 out of 3 of the Russians who came to Alaska in these 50 years I'm talking about were in fact Itelmen, Kamchadal, native people of Kamchatka. That's reasonable. They were probably already trading with Alaska native people long before the Europeans showed up. You see what I'm saying? We call them Russians because they swore allegiance to the Russian Tsar and paid their taxes. But that didn't make them ethnically Russian. They weren't blonde, blue-eyed military folk coming to Alaska in these first 50 years. They were frontiersmen who for centuries had been intermarrying with Siberian native women. And that's exactly what happened, as far as we know, as best we can research, in these first 50 years. Now, Bancroft would have everyone believe, well, Petrov would have everyone believe, that these guys came heavily armed and it was a military invasion and occupation of the Aleutian chain. First of all, they were very poorly equipped. They were coming from Siberia. And we're talking about the era before the American Revolution. If you had a gun, it took several minutes to reload. It wasn't a great technological advantage if you were outnumbered 200 to 1. You can't imagine these people landing in the Aleutian Islands with their pistols blazing. Pistols hadn't been invented yet, right? And saying, give me your furs or I'll shoot. They might have get off one shot, but they'd look like a porcupine soon after, right? There would be no point in that also, really no point. They understood quite early that sea otters don't come ashore and step into your trap as conveniently as beaver do. They're out at sea for a reason. That's why they're called sea otters, right? Who can catch the sea otters? Only the Unangan men. You need the Unangan men. You can't just come in there and destroy the community, murder all the guys. You need them. You need their techniques, their manpower to get what you want. It's much better to trade. And at first, of course, they brought blankets, frying pans, axes, metal tools. And they soon discovered, much to their delight, that Unangan people, the tribe of the Aleutian chain, valued blue beads more than anything else. A pocket full of blue beads, and you can go home with a pile of sea otter pelts. Also, these Promyshleniki, these frontiersmen, came in skin boats. They didn't have wood to build ships out of. They had to come in leather tubs. How many people can you get into a leather tub that's seaworthy? Not too many. They couldn't have been very large, right? And then you trade for your pelts, and you fill 10, 20, 30, no, 10, 20. Each pelt was worth the equivalent of $10,000. You can understand why it was worth the risk. But so if you have 10 pelts and your buddies each have 10 pelts and you've got $50,000 each, that's a successful trading expedition, isn't it? And you only had to pay with blue beads. So this was worth a fortune. And there were frontiersmen who came and went, spent their lives doing nothing but coming to Alaska, trading for a pile of sea otter pelts, going back to Russia, cashing in, making fortunes, squandering them, and coming back and doing it again. Bancroft would have us all believe that greed motivated the fur trade. I don't think so. Would our mountain men, even having made millions, have settled down, bought themselves a mansion in St. Louis and bought season tickets to the opera? You see what I'm saying? That wasn't their style. When they made a lot of money, they pretty much gave it away. They partied mightily. Taverns, as usual, make a good profit at any gold rush center. They gave generous donations to churches, monasteries, hospitals, and schools. And then they did it again and again. And that's the story of those first sort of missing 50 years. And the evidence of that is that at the beginning of the next 50, when Shelikoff recruited the first missionaries to come to Alaska, they came through the Aleutian Islands. And although they were planning to evangelize, they were planning to baptize, they were planning to convert, they found they had no one to preach to. There were chapels in every village, and the entire population had already been baptized by the frontiersmen. They had a lot of weddings. They literally had thousands of weddings. Now that's a different picture, isn't it, than what you would get from the Bancroftian history, which would be more the violence of the Wild West. Of course there were outbursts of violence, because if all the women are marrying the newcomers, and there are only so many available young brides in each village, who's going to resent? It's logical, isn't it? The young bucks are going to say, let's get rid of these guys. And so there are ambushes where dozens, I doubt if it was hundreds, but certainly dozens of men on both sides took revenge or retaliation. But it's not the story of the entire 50 years. It's 2, 3, 4 of those kind of incidents. And then, what's the use? Peace. And that's the story. Those 50 years are characterized by almost like a military invasion. I would say there's really no logical reason for such a story. It would be self-defeating to be killing off the Aleut men. And it's not supported by the rest of the story as it unfolds. So the 50 years, I would say, we still have a lot of work to do. Another third of the frontiersmen were of mixed, what in Alaska history we called Creole, mixed Slavic, native Siberian ancestry. A very small number actually Slavic people. It's 12 time zones from Alaska to Moscow. That's a long way to walk. They didn't come straight here. They filtered through. And it took centuries. So the people we call Russians, that's why I started with Alexander the Great's story. The people we call Russians are just like the citizens of Alexander's empire. Just because they were citizens of Alexander's empire doesn't make them all Macedonians. They weren't. And in the Russian Empire, they're not all Russians. It was an empire of many nations, of even the Soviet Union. So that's our first chapter. Now we have the businessmen in Irkutsk watching the riffraff, the frontiersmen, come to town with their piles of fur, cashing it in and throwing it away. And we have several bankers, investors, who are saying, let's get serious about this. Let's equip ships. Let's invest in building real ocean-going vessels. And instead of bringing back dozens of sea otter pelts, let's bring back thousands. And this appeals to certain wealthy investors in Siberia. The only one we're worried about is Gregory Shelikoff. Gregory Shelikoff comes in 1784 to my village, Old Harbor, Alaska, without any intention whatsoever in trading with the natives. He's there to exploit the furs and to extort the sea otter pelts. They come with what are called cannons, which are really more like rocket launchers or bazookas, something they could pick up and carry around, not something like you would see on a Civil War battlefield that horses need to carry and drag. Those aren't the kind of cannons he had in 1784 in Siberia. But they were nevertheless a superior technology to anything the Aleutic people of Kodiak had. The Kodiak people had resisted penetration in any influence from the Promišljeniki for decades. They wanted nothing to do with them. But the Aleuts of Kodiak and the Aleuts, the Unangan of the Aleutian chain, were traditional enemies to each other. They raided each other, they held each other hostage, they enslaved each other, they killed each other, they fought with each other. It was like the French and the Germans did for centuries in Europe. They might be neighbors, but that didn't mean they got along. So Shelikoff knew that there were POWs from Kodiak Island living in the Aleutian chain. He ransomed one and brought him home. We know his name, Gushbuck. Gushbuck was brought to Kodiak Island because he spoke the language and he had learned Russian while he was in captivity in the Aleutian chain. He was the go-between, the liaison, the translator. They gave Gushbuck all kinds of trinkets and presents and sent him to his people. Welcome home, Gushbuck, and give these to your chiefs. The chiefs were not impressed. You came with those guys. Forget it. Go home. We want nothing to do with your new buddies. So he came back to Shelikoff and said, they're rejecting your offer of peace and commerce. Well, here, we'll double it. He went back a second time. He was told by his own people, don't bother to come back again, Gushbuck. We'll kill you. Stay away. We want nothing to do with these folks. And the Alutiiq people on the eastern coast of Kodiak Island withdrew to a place that's called today Refuge Rock. It's a peninsula, sort of like what they call Magic Island here. It's an island at high tide and a peninsula at low tide, but the cliffs are much higher. It's more like Mont Saint-Michel in France, almost impregnable at high tide. So they felt pretty confident, pretty comfortable there, except Gushbuck knew the place too and betrayed his own people. And they brought up their cannon, their bazookas, their rocket launchers, and they attacked at dawn in August of 1784, and there was a massacre of several hundred people, some of them trying to escape the bombardment by jumping off the cliffs, and others simply dying in combat, fighting Shelikoff and his men, who were armed with swords and spears, as well as muskets. This is a military conquest. That's why I say it's a new start. It's a different chapter. And then Shelikoff goes back to Europe. Well, I shouldn't say back to, he was never in Europe before, but he somehow gets an audience with Catherine the Great, Catherine II of Russia. And he exaggerates all his accomplishments. He claims to have conquered single-handedly 10,000 Kodiak Alutiiq people. Now they're all taxpayers and going to be part of the empire. And he claims that he evangelized, he built a church and baptized people, he started a school. None of this is true. He made it all up, putting the best foot forward because he was asking for a monopoly on the fur trade to put all the others out of business so that he could make all the profits. It'll be much more efficient, Your Majesty. We'll bring in millions in tax revenue if you'll only give us your okay. She rejected everything, except for one proposal that Shelikoff made that attracted Her Imperial Majesty. He said that if he was granted his monopoly, he would support the evangelization of the Kodiak people. He had already built a church, which wasn't true. He had already baptized people, which wasn't true. But he needed to have a priest come with him on his return voyage. Catherine reasoned that if he had conquered 10,000 people, one poor pastor would be overworked. She gave him permission to recruit 10. That really put Shelikoff over a barrel. I mean, finding 10 people to come to Sitka today is already a task. I know it's my job. And I love Sitka. But I realize that Sitka, if you're from the lower 48, is a long way from Seattle, and even further to wherever home might be. And if you're from the rest of Alaska, it's a long way to Anchorage, and then a longer way from where your home might be. If you're living in St. Petersburg, Alaska's not even on the map. It hasn't been charted yet. You might get a zealous seminary graduate. I know this from my own personal experience. You might get a zealous seminary graduate, but his wife will never go for it. And of course, in our tradition, parish priests are married, so Shelikoff said, it's just impossible. I won't even find one, let alone 10 volunteers to go with me to Alaska. So he decided, okay, but we have monastics. We have men who have no wives, so that won't be a problem. And there's a huge monastery just up the river on Lake Ladoga, Valam. And he recruits, he gives his completely false and exaggerated recruitment speech, and he does get his 10 volunteers in keeping with Catherine the Great's decree. In the decree, he was told he had to provide for them food and transportation. I don't think he sent very much food, but we know what he understood by transportation. He bought these 10 monks new boots. They walked 8,000 miles across Siberia. And when they got to Kodiak, they found out that Shelikoff had been lying through his teeth, that there was no food for them to eat, there was no house for them to live in, and that the company, run by our namesake Alexander Baranov, was exploiting the native labor and deporting men by the hundreds to do the company's bidding. This is my point of view on Mr. Baranov. He was the Joseph Stalin of Alaska's history. From the native point of view, I calculated at one point that he deported over 3,000 men from Kodiak Island. What does that mean about the women and children left behind in a subsistence economy? And we know where they came. They came to Sitka. Old Sitka was populated not by Russians, but mostly by Kodiak Alutiiq men. And so was Fort Ross, California, much further south. This is something that we often, and I don't think Bancroft knew it, we often overlook. The Russian government forbade colonization of Alaska. You weren't allowed to come here as a colonist. This was not Jamestown or Plymouth Rock. You weren't allowed to come here unless you had a contract with the company. And when your contract expired, by law, you had to go back. They weren't interested in colonizing Alaska from the very beginning. It was not their agenda. Siberia as a big open landmass with China just south of it. Hundreds of millions of Chinese looking for elbow room are going to wind up in Siberia unless you can fill up Siberia with some of your people. They were totally disinterested in colonizing Alaska. So if you're going to have a colony here, who's going to run it? If you're going to have businesses, who's going to run the businesses? If you're going to have schools, who's going to run the schools? If you're going to have churches, who's going to run the churches? If you're going to map the place, who's going to map it? And the answer was Alaska Natives. And this is where really our story of Sitka begins. Because Shelikoff goes home, he never comes back. His wife, I'm sure his wife poisoned him, but that's another story. He built his own monument. It's an obelisk. He calls himself the Columbus of the Russian Empire. He didn't discover anything. He's nothing like Columbus. But in any case, enough about Shelikoff, but he hires Alexander Baranov as his governor, his foreman. We know about Baranov. He moves the colony from Three Saints Bay, Old Harbor, 1791 to the town of Kodiak. And then by 1799, he's here negotiating with the local Tlingit tribes to set up a trading post, build what we call Old Sitka now, here in southeast, because the British were coming. This is another factor Bancroft omits completely. The British were right next door, coming down the Yukon River. In the Russian-American period, they had a trading post at what is now Fort Yukon. They were coming down the Stikine, and they were making claims to Alaska too, because Cook had been here. So to maintain their claim, because of Chitikoff, 1741, because of Chitikoff being here so much earlier, the Russians needed to have an outpost here in what we now call Southeast Alaska. Who was going to run it? Who was going to man it? He didn't have Russian manpower. He had to rely on the Aleuts, people from the Aleutian chain and from Kodiak, and those are the people who came. Sitka was an Aleut town, well, almost into the 20th century. There were more Aleuts here than Tlinkits. The Tlinkits, you remember, moved away after the 1804 battle. The town was built by and inhabited by Aleuts. St. Michael's Cathedral, we can tell from the baptism and marriage records. All the names are names that are still familiar on the Aleutian Islands, the Alaska Peninsula, and Kodiak. That's a different picture of Sitka, isn't it? An Aleut town in the middle of Tlingitani. The Tlingit people returned. The population changed over time, but well through the 19th century and into the 20th century, Sitka was primarily, but these were Aleuts who didn't come here as colonists voluntarily. They were brought here, sent here, impressed into company service, and forced to live here in the age of Alexander Baranov. That's where my 6 saints begin. We could spend the rest of the night on them. I don't plan to. But Yuan Veniaminov was from Siberia, on Ginsk, near Irkutsk, the center of the Alaska fur trade. The furs were coming in by the thousands by that time, because the Russian-American company, Shelikoff's company, finally did get their monopoly at the hands of Tsar Paul, Catherine the Great's almost crazy son. Kodiak was named for him. They named it St. Paul Harbor, or just Pavlovskaya, Paul Harbor, in honor of the Tsarevich, the heir apparent to the Russian throne. He really was crazy. And he got bumped off, sort of by accident. There was a coup d'etat, and his son Alexander took over. But in any case, he was in favor of anything his mother wasn't. She was pro-French, he was pro-German. Anything Mama liked, Paul was against. So when he was presented with Shelikoff's proposal, was my mother for this or against it? Totally against it. Where do I sign? And that's how the Russian-American company came into being. It's still here. It's now called the Alaska Commercial Company, otherwise known as Lakeside. It's not their 150th anniversary. They're much older than that. They're Baranov's company, still in business in this town. History continues. In any case, 1724, this 27-year-old seminary graduate, the best in his class, Ioan Popov. Ioan Popov. Popov is like Russian for Smith. John. He might as well be named John Smith. There are probably 4 or 5 other Ioan Popovs in his graduating class. And that's why the faculty at the Irkutsk seminary decided to change his name. People weren't particularly attached to their last names, by the way. It was another one of Peter the Great's ideas. Germans and French and Englishmen all have last names. Russians have to have last names. How do you get a last name? Usually by your profession. Plotnik is carpenter, Plotnikov, carpenter. Well, we have people with the last name Carpenter. That's because their ancestors got that name generations ago. Kashavar, cook. Kashavarov, cook. Captain Cook. We have Kashavarov Street here. It's just the Russian word for the cooks. You see, they got last name according to their profession. But there were too many clergy. So the clergy got named for holidays. Well, there's a famous Russian naturalist, Voznesensky. Voznesenia is Ascension, the 40th day after Easter. There's Rojestvenski. Rojestvo is Christmas. So you have Peter Christmas, Charlie Ascension, David Epiphany. That became their names, if you translate them. Then there were still too many clergy. Those were only for the holidays were only for the senior clergy. For some reason, the middle-ranked clergy got birthstones. Robert Ruby, or the equivalent, you know, Peter Pearl, and so forth. And then everybody else got Popov. So there were an awful lot of Popov. So with this man, Ioan Popov, whose father had died in infancy, he never knew his father, he was sort of an orphan, raised by his uncle. His uncle was the town tinkerer, who fixed everything that broke, or everything that could be fixed, in any case. He was raised by this, who was also the sexton or warden of the church. So he was involved with the church, and he went to seminary. Seminary was the equivalent of a high school diploma in those days. It wasn't a graduate level or a college degree. It was the equivalent of high school, maybe +1. But that was his education. He was the valedictorian. They gave him a new name, Benjamin. And that's how Ioan becomes Ioan Veniaminov, of the Benjamins, Veniaminov. He was named after the recently deceased bishop of Irkutsk, the town where they were living. And as Ioan Veniaminov, valedictorian of his class, the faculty wanted to send him to Europe for extended theological doctoral work. He wasn't interested. He didn't want to be an academic. He wasn't interested in being a college professor. He volunteered instead for Alaska. And his first stop was Sitka. And he began learning the Aleut language in Sitka, because most of the people living in Sitka at that time were Unangan-speaking Aleuts. He learned it here, and by the time he got to the Aleutian Islands, he had an alphabet made up for them, and he began teaching school. He opened the first schools there. He ran a meteorological station. He kept records of climate and temperature and wind speed and precipitation and all of that. He wrote books on the Aleut language, on the Aleut culture. He paddled for 10 years along the Aleutian chain. He must have been rather impressive. Most Unangan people were relatively short. He was 6'4", 200 and something pounds. Here in Sitka, I remember one biographer calling him Paul Bunyan in a cassock. But in any case, 10 years in the Aleutian Islands, and then he came back to Sitka and learned Tlingit. In 1838, after another decade or so here, he sent all his translations to St. Petersburg to be published. And when the shipment finally came back, there were so many typographical errors in the books, they were absolutely useless. No one in St. Petersburg knew his Aleut alphabet or his Tlingit alphabet, and there was no one there to proofread anything. So he applied for a sabbatical. He'd never been to Europe. The company gave him leave to travel to Honolulu, where was the next? Sydney, Australia, Cape Town, South Africa, the Canary Islands, Southampton, England, Copenhagen, Denmark, and finally St. Petersburg, 7 months at sea. By the time he reached the capital, word had reached there that his wife and children, there were 8, who had gone to Siberia to visit their relatives, most of the children had never seen Russia, that his wife and their youngest child had died in an epidemic out near Irkutsk. His immediate response was, forget the books, I've got to go find my kids. But the emperor, Nicholas I, had heard about this famous man who had written so many reports about the Aleutian Islands and Sitka, and he wanted to meet him. Ivan Veniaminov was summoned to the Winter Palace, and the Tsar expressed his condolences. Father Ivan says, yes, I'm ready to leave, go reunite with my kids. The Tsar said, no, no, no. We need men like you in Alaska. I want you to go back as bishop. He wasn't looking for an ecclesiastical promotion. He went to Kiev to pray. He came back and submitted. God's will be done. And in the Kazan Cathedral in St. Petersburg, Kazan, you remember being the place where the Tatars were defeated? They brought the icon from Kazan, Our Lady of Kazan, to Moscow in the time of Ivan the Terrible and built a special cathedral just for that. It's like the Russian Liberty Bell. It's the symbol of their liberation from the Tatars back in the 1500s. And at the other end of Red Square is St. Basil's Cathedral, the one with the 8 little domes. Each one of those is a memorial chapel, and there's only a service in one of those once a year. Each of those chapels are dedicated to the feast day on which there was a battle. And the soldiers who died in that battle are remembered once a year on the anniversary of that battle inside that chapel. And then the main victory, October 1st, is the main altar for that Protection of the Mother of God church. And it's a war memorial with barely room for 2 or 3 people to celebrate a service in each one of those tiny little chapels, and then enough for maybe 20 people to gather in the main church. But it's probably the landmark of Moscow. They call it St. Basil's, and St. Basil has nothing to do with it. It's just a local, it's the Protection of the Mother of God church, but it's one chapel for each of the battles leading up to the liberation of Russia at the Battle of Kazan. So at the Cathedral of Kazan in St. Petersburg, which has a replica of the Kazan Mother of God, our bishop, Ivan Veniaminov, became Innocent Veniaminov and returned to Sitka, where I think all of you probably know, he designed St. Michael's Cathedral. He built the clock for the clock tower himself. That's thanks to his uncle's tinkering profession in his early... The throne or the seat he carved himself is still there. His original mitre, his hand cross, his Aleut gospel, it's all a part of our treasury here in Sitka. I don't know how many people in Sitka have seen it, but the tourists see it every summer by the thousands. Sort of like the Statue of Liberty in New York. You don't get there, but everybody comes to see it. Anyway, he was doing such a good job, they gave him Kamchatka. And then finally, Eastern Siberia. He became Archbishop in the city of Yakutsk, which you might know if you play the board game Risk. The coldest, darkest, most inhospitable place on earth, 30, 40, 50 below zero, and he was in his 60s, early 70s, losing his eyesight. In 1868, at the age of 71, he got a telegram that he was elected Archbishop of Moscow. He was shocked, but he went. I remember coming across his acceptance speech. He's in the Westminster Abbey of Russia, Uspensky Sobor, Dormition Cathedral in the Moscow Kremlin. The Tsar and the royal family are sitting there. The faculty of the Academy of Theology that he never attended are sitting there. He stands before them and says, I don't know what I'm doing here. I've spent my whole life in the boonies. I've been in Alaska, I've been in Siberia, I'm a country boy myself. I have the equivalent of a high school diploma. My predecessor had several doctorates and spoke 7 modern languages. I can only speak indigenous languages from the tribes I've worked with. I'm losing my eyesight. I'm 71. Give me a break. I should have turned this job down. I'm paraphrasing, but it's very much like this. So he turns to the faculty, these guys with all their PhDs, and says, You do not deserve an illiterate leader like me. Pray that through my ignorance, nothing bad happens. We have heads of state in our country who could make such a speech. But this is not only a genius, this is a humble man. And then he spends the last 11 years of his life and builds the biggest church in all of Moscow, Christ the Savior Church, which is another war memorial, a war memorial dedicated to the soldiers who fought in the Napoleonic invasions. Stalin hated this church. It dominated the skyline. He looked out his window, there was this big church. He decided to demolish it. And he did. It was big newsreels in the 1930s, this huge cathedral being demolished by the communists to build the tallest building in the world to the glory of world communism. They tried. As they tried to rebuild on the site of what was the Cathedral of Christ the Savior, a sinkhole opened up. So they decided, okay, we'll make the basement plans larger. The sinkhole got bigger. Every time they tried to build on it, it crumbled. Finally, Khrushchev in the 1950s was so embarrassed by this sinkhole, he lined it with concrete and called it the world's largest outdoor swimming pool, which you really don't need in Moscow. After the fall of communism, that property was returned to the church. They rebuilt a replica of Christ the Savior Cathedral on the same spot with no problem. So at both ends of Yuan Venyaminov's career, Sitka, Alaska, where we have the replica of his cathedral after the 1966 fire, and in Moscow, at the other end of his missionary life, there are two replicas of his work, but not bad for a guy who was an orphan and a high school grad. I think he's the most extraordinary man who ever lived in Sitka. The Russian bishop's house is built for him. His apartment's still there, his bed's still there, his books are still there, his desk's still there. Yes, it is a little bed, but I understand they slept sitting up in those days. They were afraid of respiratory problems. I can't imagine how comfortable it was, but if that's what everybody does, you get used to it, I guess. In any case, this is something to consider as I've been here only since last July. There's a Shelikoff Street here. We're on Baranov Island, and his statue is right out front. And there's nothing to mention Yuan Venyaminov in this town. Can't we at least find a street? The next time we name a street, let's resolve. There should be, I think, there should be a Venyaminov Street, even if we mispronounce it. Because he's one of the most amazing men ever to live in this city, and we have nothing to recall his memory. Runner-up is Netsvetov. Yakov Netsvetov was a colleague of Yuan Venyaminov. Venyaminov. I have his icon here. You've probably seen it, but this is the icon that we have in our dining room. Three native languages. He went to California and conversed with Franciscan clergy in his high school Latin. I couldn't have done a conversation in high school Latin when I was still taking high school Latin. He was 30 years out of school. The man was in so many ways an extraordinary genius and the founder of really Alaskan education, because his schools, the school which is the Russian bishop's house, continued well into the 20th century, teaching Alaska Native people to be all those things that we mentioned: school teachers, missionaries, musicians, cartographers, shipbuilders, navigators. Men from this school on Lincoln Street attended the Russian Naval Academy and became officers in the Russian military. One major general, Andrew Kashavarov, sailed around the world several times. Of course, he's Aleut, not Tlingit, but that's what the people who lived here. Yeah, exactly, and there's a street Kashavarov, too. Right, sure. They're still here. Well, the founder of the Territorial Museum and now the Alaska State Museum is also another Kashavarov, who could read and write and speak 4 languages: Aleut, Tlingit, Russian, and English. But we don't realize that he was Alaska Native. You see what I'm saying? The Native history gets covered up because, Russians. But it's not. It's Alaska Native people. Netsvetov is has a Russian father and an Aleut mother, and he goes to the same seminary as Venyaminov. He comes back to Alaska and he learns Veniaminov's writing system, his alphabet. He translates more books than Veniaminov ever did and lives 20 years in the Aleutian Islands, paddling along the entire chain and as far as Hokkaido, Japan, in a kayak. Alaska native. He runs the first Aleut schools. He publishes the first books. Then his wife dies here in Sitka. Her grave is on Marine Street. And the tombstone that he put there when he came to Sitka is still in place. Anna Semyonovna Netsvetova, wife of Archpriest Yakov Netsvetov, and her birthday, only he would have known her birthday. And the day of her death, they had no children. Who else would have put the tombstone there? At this place awaits the resurrection on the last day. Her husband did that. He spent, however, when she died, he had petitioned to retire and go back to Russia. And St. Innocent Veniaminov said, of course, Father Yakov, as soon as I find a replacement. 18 years later, he finally retired here to Sitka. He spent those 18 years on the Yukon River learning Yupik and evangelizing the Yupik people and laying the foundation for the Christian faith among the Yupik people in the Kuskokwim Yukon Delta. So 20 years among his own people in the Aleutians, based at Atka, and 18 more among the Yupiks. And then he came here to Sitka, died in the Russian bishop's house, and is buried near that rather odd building by the blockhouse, but you know, the one with the 4 posts and a cupola on the top. His grave is somewhere very close to that, maybe not exactly there. But he was another extraordinary Alaska Native man, opening the first schools in the Western Aleutians, building churches and schools and translating texts into giving the Yupik people their own alphabet, as Veniaminov had given the Aleuts their own alphabet. You see where this comes from. Macedonia. So we have here in Sitka then this tradition of multicultural, multilingual people speaking, reading, and writing and going to school and studying in their own native language as well as Russian as their entree into the data bank of the rest of the planet. Becoming college graduates. The first Tlingit graduate was coming back on the Neva. That's 1813. It wasn't all fighting. In fact, the more I study our history, there was a whole lot more love-making than war-making. There was a whole lot more rapport. There were widows from the old Sitka who went back to their own people after their husbands had been killed in the 1802 attack. And they were informants about Russian behavior and such. If you've seen, if you've read Anushi Tlingit Ani Ka, Richard and Nora Dauenhauer, Lydia Black's book on that. I don't need to repeat that. But Netsvetov was an extraordinary person, and he died here in Sitka in 1864, and he's the only one of these buried here. Tikhon Balavin was bishop of well, I shouldn't skip Anatoly. Anatoly Kamensky was a bishop, was a priest here. He was assigned in 1892 and left in 1898, so 6 years or so he was here. He learned Tlingit. They all did. They learned the language of the people they were serving. There are Anatoly Kamensky. He was only here for 6 years. He went back to Russia. He eventually became a bishop and was killed by the communists in 1924. Tikhon Balavin is next. He was bishop of Alaska from 1898 to 1907. But by that time, there were so many immigrants coming into the country, he had to move the headquarters of the church from San Francisco to New York, because the bulk of the Orthodox population were immigrants by that time. But he changed the title, his own title, from the Bishop of the Aleutian Islands and Alaska. His title was Bishop of the Aleutian Islands and North America. Of course, Aleuts love this title. You can imagine the map of North America they would have made. The Aleutian Islands and North America in the little corner in the bottom, right? But Balavin was extraordinary too, because he became an American citizen. He spoke English. He learned the English language because that's what you do, you see. Now we're not moving out of tribal languages into the national language of the United States. The first, I have Netsvetov's icon here too, with the church he built at Yukon, on the Yukon in the background, and the Yukon River. But in any case, this is when he would have been about 60 years old. He died at the age of 60. I could tell you more of his stories, but we just don't have time. Balavin, however, was an extraordinary man. He loved America, he learned English, and he actually had this book that's still in use in our churches around the whole country. It's simply called the Service Book. It's translated from Russian, from Church Slavonic, the language of Rostislav and Cyril and Methodius. It's translated from that into English in 1906 by an Episcopalian lady, actually, Isabella Hapgood, whom Tikhon hired to translate Orthodox services into English, and it's still in wide use across the entire country after more than a century and more. That's a picture of Patriarch. He became Patriarch of Russia. Alaska has produced two men who have become archbishops of Moscow. Yuan Veniaminov is the first, Tikhon Balavin is the second. He didn't actually live here. He was traveling all the time, but when he came to Sitka, he slept in the Russian bishop's house. That was officially his residence. He went back to Russia in 1914 and was elected Archbishop of Yaroslavl, a fairly large city. And then in 1917, by lot, he was chosen as the first patriarch in over 300 years. It was the booby prize of church history, because he became patriarch at exactly the same time the Bolsheviks were seizing power. He was placed under arrest, he was tortured, and died suspiciously in 1925 in house arrest in Donskoy Monastery in Moscow. And then for 60 years, nobody knew what happened to him. The communists didn't want people coming to his grave. They didn't want to make a martyr out of him, even though he was clearly a martyr. And then after the fall of communism, some old Bolshevik, probably angry that the church was being resurrected, came through that monastery and threw a Molotov cocktail through the window and started to burn that church, that little church down. There's a big church and a little church in the center of this monastery. The fire department came quickly and put out the fire, but there was a big hole in the floor. And under that hole, they found a coffin. And inside that coffin, the green mantilla, or cloak, of a patriarch of Moscow, Tikhon Balavin, whose body had never decayed. Not embalmed, but had never decayed. You see, this is where the communists got the idea of keeping Lenin under glass. Because... And they then moved his body, his relics, to the larger church where people come and pray and visit. And remember, Tikhon Balavin, a friend of mine in Moscow painted me an icon of him. His feast day is April 7th, so just past last month, just before. And of course, my friend is a jeweler, so I got more jewels than icon maybe, but it's an extraordinary icon of Tikhon Balavin as Patriarch of Moscow, but originally Bishop of Sitka, or rather, the Aleutian Islands in North America. But he's ours. He lived, and he had a protege, a seminarian he brought here to teach at the school. He was a young man in his late teens, early 20s. And they sent him to the Aleutian Islands. Everybody gets sent to the Aleutian Islands eventually, I guess. They sent him out to the Aleutian Islands. He taught school there. Then he came back and was ordained here in Sitka. He was ordained deacon in Sitka at St. Michael's Cathedral. He was ordained priest at St. Michael's Cathedral. He took monastic vows at St. Michael's Cathedral. And the climate apparently wasn't agreeing with him. I didn't know that he had learned any native languages until recently. We found in the archives a prayer book in Alutiiq. And on the inside cover it says, property of Father Seraphim. And the archivist in Kodiak said, I have no idea who this Father Seraphim is. I can't find any record of him. I said, I know who it is. It was that seminarian. When he became a monk, he took the name Seraphim, and he was assigned to Nuchek in Prince William Sound, and he was serving the liturgy in Alutiiq in Prince William Sound in the early 1900s. So, you see how we're on a roll here? Almost everybody who comes becomes familiar with and teaches and serves and preaches in the Alaska Native languages. Now, of course, right down the street, at Sheldon Jackson's school, there was a very different philosophy of education. If you're going to be civilized, if you're going to become a citizen of the United States, you have to renounce your language and culture and have 5 teachers sign off on it, and then you can vote. Then you can be a citizen. You see where that idea comes from, though? It's not Dr. Jackson's original idea. It comes from that long history of Western Europe versus Eastern Europe. They were simply enforcing a mentality that goes back 2,000 years. It took 1,000 years for it to come westward across the United States and reach Sitka in the 1860s. It took another 1,000 years for that opposite idea to go across Siberia and reach Sitka in the 1860s. And the debate was right here on Lincoln Street. You can read the correspondence between the teachers at what we call the Russian Bishop's House today, the Orthodox school, and the Federal American school down the street. And they're arguing about how can the Americans are taking the barbarian attitude. You cannot civilize people in a barbarian language. Better, the sooner we stamp out these languages, the better. We have to elevate them and bring them up to our standard. But you see, that's not the Commissioner of Education in Juneau's original idea. He's part of a 2,000-year-long history of that attitude coming from the western part of Europe. And St. Innocent, St. Yaakov, all these men that I've mentioned, they were also just part of their own culture. When you meet a new tribal people, you learn their language, you develop an alphabet for them, you publish books, and you open a school. Why? Because that's their history. That's how the Slavic people of Eastern Europe became civilized, in their own language with their own alphabet, and they simply assumed across all of Siberia and well into Alaska now that that's simply what you do. It's not an original idea. They were linguistic geniuses, but you see, it was part of their history. It's what they had been doing for hundreds of years. Dr. Jackson was from Schenectady, New York. He'd never met a shaman. All the monks who walked across Siberia met dozens of shamans. They met shamans in Kodiak. They met shamans on the mainland. They knew what shamans were. They were healers and prophets. They sat down and talked shop. Dr. Jackson gets off the boat, meets his first Tlingit shaman, and orders him arrested and shaved and scrubbed and basically defrocked. It's his attitude. It's not his original idea. That's why I started with where we did. And lastly, there's two other saints that I don't really have much time to mention, but there's, I finished Seraphim. Seraphim was just a boy. He came here as a teenager, young man, was ordained here, entered a monk here, spent a decade in Alaska, most of it in the Aleutian chain, but everything important to his life happened in Sitka. When Tikhon went back to Russia, he went back with him. And they were apparently close associates, because when Tikhon became bishop, in Yaroslavl, he made Seraphim his vicar bishop, his right-hand man. And then when he became patriarch and was arrested, this young guy, 25 years old, wound up being the temporary patriarch of all of Russia. His life was much more difficult. After Tikhon was murdered in 1925, I think I counted Seraphim was arrested 7 times, sent to different concentration camps, labor camps, and finally was executed in 1937 in one of the great purges of the communist era. They estimate that between 12 and 20 million Christians were killed in the communist era. It's a Holocaust that's off our radar screen. But they lived in Sitka first. The last one is Sebastian Dapovic, a Serb who was dean of our cathedral only for a few months, but became a missionary all over the world, where he's traveled even more than me. He was everywhere, and he started churches wherever he went, and he was canonized by the Serbian Orthodox Church just a couple years ago, buried in Jackson, California. He was actually born an American citizen. None of the others were, because they were all citizens of the Russian Empire in their time. They may have been Alaskan, but they weren't American, as Sebastian Dapovic was. So although I titled my talk The 6 Saints of Sitka, you see, they wouldn't have been saints if they hadn't been part of this whole cultural legacy of respecting tribal peoples and their languages as their own language and culture had been respected in their time. It's a long story. It goes back 2,000 years. But I simply wanted to highlight that all of them were saints because they embraced the people they were serving. And I would end with this as a missionary principle that I pass on to other pastors. You can't save what you don't love. You can't save what you don't love. Teachers should love the subject matter that they're teaching, that's part of it, and they should love the kids to whom they're trying to impart that love of that subject. Those are the best teachers I've had, not just the ones who loved history, but who loved history and loved the students of history. Pastors have to love their teachings, their doctrine, their Bible, and their theology, but they also have to love the people they're trying to impart it to, and these men did that. And they did it to people with great respect in their own language, respecting their cultures. And I think that now, finally, it's what we need in our country more than anything else. We can't just live in our own little isolated cultural parameters. We've got to be able to appreciate and understand and respect people beyond those. Anchorage, Alaska has the top 3 most culturally diverse high schools in the United States. East High is 1, West High is number 2, and Bartlett is number 3. We have 97 of the top 100 most diverse elementary schools in the United States. Alaska has become, again, as culturally diverse as ever. But our history says that people from different races and cultures, from different parts of the world, have been coming here and intermarrying and raising kids who have become multicultural and multilingual, and they have been the leaders in our state from the very beginning of its history. If we tell our history this way, if we tell Alaska history this way, I think it encourages the kids of today to say, well, if they did it then, we can do it now. Another point, education made it possible for the Aleuts who were overrun by the Promyshleniki, and then the Aleuts who were, I would say, enslaved by Baranov. Education made it possible for them to come here and assume control of their lives, to become real leaders in the development of Alaska. It's a point completely missing in the Bancroft history. They don't get any credit for anything. But it was the people of mixed, the people the Russian census called the Creoles. It was the people who were of mixed who had access to and familiarity with several languages and several cultures. They're the ones who made the most extraordinary contributions. Those are the kind of kids that are going to come out of those high schools. We're going to have tall, skinny Sudanese refugees marrying little Yupik girls. Combinations we never would have thought of 30 years ago. That's our future. But it's also our past. If we know our past, we can pass that on to our kids and say, go for it. We've been here before. We've had marginalized people of limited educational background who within a generation were running the show. If they did it then, we can do it again today. I think that's the real lesson of the 6 saints of Sitka. Thank you for being here this evening.